I don't know, progressive, but just wanting even more change than what the leadership is just, prescribing. So you have the unions, and then you have the shippers, of course, and the ongoing issues. But just, with the Surface Transportation Board, taking up a lot of, shipper issues and shipper decisions this year, there's that momentum there too. So it feels like there's just a lot of, I don't know. I mean, to me, the years I've covered it, I feel like there's momentum to going forward as opposed to being stagnant. And I don't know exactly where the industry will go, but I think that's momentum. I think that's probably the big surprise, in addition to rail service.
Yeah, you would hope the service would get better with all of these things that are taking place, and sort of the push to hire more workers and all these things, sort of the backing off of the embargoes, all the things that the Surface Transportation Board is focused on, things like requiring more service-related data. And I guess it didn't surprise me that there were service failures last year. I think what surprised me was that there were orders to have mandatory, service from the Surface Transportation Board, like the Foster Farm situation, which has now been sort of two different iterations of that, based on what you've been, reporting on FreightWaves.com. So I think that was a surprise to me. And I think, if I was going to answer that question, I would say, well, one thing that surprised me was that the railroad sick days got to be one of the biggest political footballs in the United States, something that impacts 100,000 people, and all of Congress has an opinion about this, and sort of extrapolated this out to be something that impacts or is sort of emblematic of impacting all unionized labor, all sort of blue collar labor against management, rather than kind of an industry specific issue, and sort of without the context that was something that the unions kind of negotiated away for a higher pay scale during previous iterations. So I think that was a surprise for me. But from here, sort of maybe enough about 2022. Maybe we'll talk about 2023. And this article you just wrote, expect to hear more about rail service issues in 2023. I think there's no question that that's true. And, what this sort of amounts to is have another, there's the article, you can check that out on FreightWaves.com, but have a list that I went through, you read that article, and have this list of major rail regulatory, issues. And there it is. It's just kind of this laundry list of things that the Surface Transportation Board, may or may not, deal with. Sort of that first thing is CP-KCS merger. So we're expecting that in the first quarter of the year. That I think most people expect that to be approved. Have you heard of anything to the contrary? Anyone who thinks it's not going to be approved?
I haven't. No, I feel like everyone's kind of saying that. And, obviously CP, wants it to be approved sooner than later. So I haven't heard anything really from the STB itself, but yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see like when exactly the timing of that will happen. And of course, and as an aside, earnings season is actually coming up fairly soon. And so even though I don't think Canadian Pacific has announced when they're releasing their fourth quarter results, but I mean that's that's a time when the railroads can kind of talk about possible merger outcomes in terms of like the keeping access and stuff like that. So interchange, I mean, yeah.
And then I guess the other question sort of related to that is what happens in terms of mitigation, where there's the Canadian National wanted that one line divested in the Midwest. That might have been maybe overly ambitious. Some of the other railroads want to ensure that there's competition on freight that crosses the U.S.-Mexico border. Do you have any sense of what the mitigation measures might be there?
Yeah, I want to say that that there's work to try to not necessarily divest that line that belongs to Kansas City Southern and give it to CN. Maybe not quite divest it, but maybe something along, trackage rights or something that, would be more than more than just saying a flat out no, but like, something a little bit, like a little bit of a give and take there. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the outcome will be in the end. And also, as an aside, our colleague Noy Mahoney wrote article in late December about sort of expect more cross-border traffic between the U.S. and Mexico in 2023, and that's actually this week's Rail newsletter. But that's another interesting thing to check out for people if you want to read up more about what trends we might see in cross-border traffic this year.
Yeah, and that could be one of the reasons why it ultimately gets approved is the shippers now with that combined railroad system, can more easily market those, bulk commodities further away from the point of origin. So I think it's really going to be interesting to see how that changes, supply chains. I mean, will Canadian grain be marketed in Mexico instead of just being sort of exported out of the port of Vancouver? There could have implications for the auto industry, just with more, auto parts going on one railroad from, let's say, Detroit into the assembly plants in Mexico. So there's a lot there. Intermodal, sort of having that connection between Dallas and Chicago under one railroad. There could be more investments there, so more sort of north-south intermodal between the third and fourth largest metro areas in the country. That could take a lot of trucks off the road. So I think it's interesting. I think the railroads have made a good case that it's in the public interest because of the added competition. And in no cases are you going from 3 rails to 2 rails or from 2 rails to 1 rail. So I'm with sort of the consensus that thinking it's going to be approved. I think it's the only Class 1 railroad merger that could be approved, but that's certainly something that we'll watch in 2023. So the next 2 things on your list of items to watch, sort of service issues, and we've already talked about a little bit about that, but also labor issues, which go right into service. And at least the railroads have blamed the labor issues, for a lot of the service issues. They say the job market's been so tight, that's why the service has been bad. The Surface Transportation Board has sort of made the connection to say, well, is it that bad because you have not invested in terminals and you sort of cut into the bone with the crewing costs, and if just made the job sort of something that the railroad workers don't want to do, and even though the pay is higher than what a lot of these workers would otherwise get, and probably type of jobs they do get on furloughs, it's just not an attractive job, sort of in spite of a relatively attractive pay scale. And I know there's been other things with labor, like the port workers working without a contract since July 1st, and you mentioned in the article alternative to furloughs. So maybe 2-part question. Sort of what others are alternative to furloughs? Might we expect? And do you think all of these new trainees and new hires that have been going through the railroad ranks the last several months, do you think we're going to see them stick around when things get tough, like being outside in the middle of January in Chicago or having to go to rural Minnesota when it's sub-zero temperatures? Any thoughts there on labor?
Yeah. So it's interesting because Norfolk Southern had an investor day, I think in early December, and they wanted to really emphasize that they were looking at alternatives to furloughing. The president and CEO, Alan Shaw, he was talking about how they want to, during those times when there is a bit of a market downturn, is there a way to help, provide more training to employees, or is there a way to sort of keep them on board without having to furlough them? The argument being that, if you furlough them, 1, of course, they might not come back, but 2, we have the problem that happened this past year in terms of like not being able to have the headcount needed, the crews needed to meet that market demand. So I guess they were kind of arguing the long term, furloughing might not be the best option. And I think too, even gig economy aside, it's just, I think there's more of a wish to recruit and attract candidates, and you can't just kind of. I feel like there's momentum that you can't kind of keep the status quo of the way that things have gone in terms of assuming that employees will stick around once the furloughing ends. But in terms of new recruits, it's just strange because I had seen some articles saying, and so I don't. I can't really back this up necessarily, but like I had seen some reports saying that that sometimes the Class 1 railroads had engaged in a lot of hiring efforts, and but there were actually a number of people who left during the training process, and so it'll be interesting to see how things shake out, especially given one, the existing more low morale, but two, the efforts to change things. You kind of hear, now that the bargaining, the collective bargaining is done for now, you kind of hear sort of the potential for talk at the local level in terms of how can the unions and the railroads work together to manage operations or create a work environment that might encourage people to stay on.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to work through there, and it does seem like there needs to be a change in how the workers work if they're going to be able to recruit. I think it's just a lot of people during the pandemic sort of just rethought what they were doing with their lives, and it's really not a profession for any kind of work-life balance, being at home, et cetera. Sort of moving on to this next topic within your article that you mentioned, or maybe it wasn't, maybe I'm just bringing this up, but sort of did you listen to the embargo hearings in DC the other week with the Union Pacific? And if so, sort of what stood out to you from those hearings?
Yeah, I think for me the biggest thing was just how a number of shippers were talking about that the Union Pacific wasn't meeting its common carrier obligation because of the extent of the embargoes that have occurred, and with the embargoes occurring because of congestion issues as opposed to weather related disruptions and stuff like that. So I think hearing that, because that's kind of like, those are fighting words, in a way. It kind of, and I can't remember if it was individual Surface Transportation Board members who asked the shippers if Union Pacific was meeting the common carrier obligation, or if it was something that they brought up on their own. I want to, well, yeah. So, but it's still, it's interesting, especially since especially since one of the sort of regulatory pursuits by shippers is modifying that definition, which I understand it to be. And Mike, feel free to offer a better definition, but sort of the freight railroads are obligated to carry freight under reasonable sort of not circumstances, but reasonable terms, and that was because that was related to the Staggers Act and deregulation. I don't know if you might have a better way of explaining what the common carrier obligation is. It sounds so simple, but then everyone talks about how
it's basically the railroads have to take the freight and move the freight, even if it's something that's not profitable for them and they'd rather not take. They can't say no, and that was sort of their obligation in exchange for owning the trackage lines. So the railroads own all that property that the tracks are on, but in exchange for getting that property given to them by the government, they have this common carrier obligation. And so, like you said, they have to provide a reasonable service. The question is, what is reasonable, as so often is the question in legal matters. And railroads can provide a service at a lower cost by just having really bad service and slotting it into their network when it is convenient for them, or doing like what Union Pacific did, which was have over 1,000 embargoes in 2022, when embargoes, typically is something that's used in the event of, some unusual act of God, a hurricane, flood, polar vortex, not because their terminal is getting a little bit too congested and they'd rather not have those cars, or they'd rather use rather the shipper use the cars that the railroad owns rather than their private cars. And so I thought the shippers made a good case that Union Pacific really wasn't, at a very minimum, was using the embargoes improperly, if not also violating common carrier obligation. And then it seemed to me like the Surface Transportation Board took that a couple steps further and tied that, need to use all those embargoes to not having enough investment in terminals, lengthening the passing sidings, having enough people. And the Surface Transportation Board basically said, okay, when there's actually is an event, a polar vortex, hurricane, flood, it's really going to disrupt the network because service is that bad when you don't have those type of issues. And, all this stuff, how the Southwest Airlines debacle has dominated the news the last, 2 weeks, there's parallels there between that Southwest Airlines and the rail terminals, where Southwest could have avoided all those issues by having state-of-the-art, technology. Now that would have been, required a big, capital expenditure and, people to have them running, but, they should have done that. And then you sort of think about, well, is the railroad industry, going to have a big debacle like that if there's a polar vortex in Chicago, or big hurricane or something, at some place that's of great importance, because they just don't have any cushion in how much resources they have.
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually thinking about that as well during, I was hearing about Southwest over the Christmas holiday. In a way, I was wondering if there were rail people kind of watching what was going on and saying, okay, is there something that we can learn from this? And I was also wondering, if anyone in rail was kind of thankful that that it didn't happen to them, so to speak. To see it play it out as publicly as it did with Southwest. Yeah, I was thinking that too. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to move on. So what's the latest with Foster Farms? You've written about that a couple times. And so there was, Union Pacific ordered trains that need to be expedited for the animal feed back in June or July. Is that right? And, there was some requirement to monitor the service to make sure that they kept up with those improved service levels. And then Foster Farms came back and said, well, they hadn't kept up with those service levels, and STB ordered UP to deliver those train sets of animal feed again. So like when I first saw this, I was like, well, is this an old article? Didn't we have this like a few months ago? But I guess this was almost a repeat of the emergency service order from a few months ago. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think it's interesting because the Surface Transportation Board kept that docket open until I think mid-late January, just in case something happens. And I think actually things were resolved at some point, like earlier this year. But then Foster Farm says that, in October that service issues started up again. And Union Pacific has said that it's, because of the bad weather that, that not just UP was facing, but also other railroads were facing. So, it's interesting. For UP to get all the spotlight in terms of, the Foster Farms and then, of course, the embargoes. And then, but then, you also hear about, or not here, but there was a release the other day, which I didn't write up but it was about how the the traffic from Schneider has actually gone to Union Pacific now. It was already a done deal, but like that traffic now. So it'll be interesting to see too with that new arrangement how service will go for UP, and whether they'll be able to address those also existing issues that they're facing as well.
Yeah, a lot of those domestic intermodal companies that were not called, JB Hunt, that felt like they were getting sort of second-class service on the BNSF, went over to UP over the years. Mm-hmm. I mean, Hub Group did that, I want to say, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It was a long time ago. But, you've had others like, Schneider, Knight Swift do that more recently. But, hopefully they're not disappointed with the rail, service levels, like you say. I mean, that could be a pretty big thing. So what else do you have, that you're working on for this upcoming week?
Yeah. So let's see. It's kind of the quiet before the storm in terms of when it hits earnings season in mid late January. I was gonna say mid late July, not quite, but. A couple of things. I had spoken with Wabtec in December about hydrogen locomotives, which I know we've written about before. But the as spoke with a guy there, and he had some really sort of neat thoughts about the hydrogen technology. So I hope to get that out soon. And I also just wrote something today just about how. Looking at the rail volumes in 2022 and comparing them with the past years, looking at the public data that the Association of American Railroads puts out. So, so those are two things right now, and then of course some other stuff as well. So.
Yeah, Wabtec's always an interesting one to follow. I mean, they have so much sort of innovation in terms of things like you said, there's alternative energy, but then also doing things like repair and refurbishing older locomotives, which really saves a lot of capital expenditure. They do a lot with the braking, a lot some on the sort of the wayside. Too, they're a big part of the positive train control, which is another issue that we'll get into maybe on another show. Is should there be one person cruise in a train because there is positive train control, which is a way to stop a train anytime that there's human failure. That's on all the tracks that there's either hazardous material or passenger. But that's, I think, a topic for another show. In the last few seconds, if people are not signed up for your newsletter, how do they do that?
Yeah, so there is. Yeah, there's a link on the website. Thankfully, I think in most of my articles that I write, there's a link at the bottom too of the article that links you to the webpage, and of course you can sign up for Rail, and you can sign up for all the other great newsletters that FreightWaves provides. So.
Okay, so great. So go do that, and if anyone needs anything from me, feel free to reach out. Hope everyone has a great day.
FreightWaves app.
The truck is now 3 days a week.